There is a kind of invisibility that does not come from absence but from excess. The more someone tries to be seen, explained, recognized, the more predictable they become, easier to read, easier to hit, and over time, more vulnerable. Many people move through life exposing everything: feelings, intentions, plans, pain, reactions. They talk too much, react too fast, show too much. They believe this is authenticity, but they don't notice the quiet cost of constant transparency. Anything predictable can be used against you. Anything overexposed loses its strength. The desire to be recognized is human. The problem begins when it starts to govern behavior, when every action seeks external response, when every silence creates anxiety, when every gesture needs to be noticed to have value. At that point, the person stops living their own life and starts performing it. The psychological root of this movement is tied to the fear of irrelevance, the fear of not being considered, of not leaving a mark. To compensate, many become excessively visible. They comment on everything, react to everything, explain everything, as if the world constantly needed to know who they are. But this continuous exposure does not strengthen, it weakens. The more someone reveals, the more they hand over their vulnerabilities. The more they explain, the more material they offer for judgment. The more they react, the more they lose control of their own rhythm. Little by little, their image becomes shaped by others' reactions. They stop being guided by internal criteria and begin adjusting to the environment. The tone changes with the audience. Behavior shifts with feedback. Life becomes a permanent state of adaptation. This creates exhaustion, not physical, but mental, a fatigue that comes from constant vigilance. The mind never rests because it is always asking how it was seen, how it was interpreted, how it will be remembered. Stoicism sees this clearly. For the Stoics, freedom begins when life stops being a spectacle. Epictetus taught that the less someone depends on others' opinions, the more solid they become internally, not because they isolate themselves, but because they stop bargaining their dignity in every interaction. True strength in this sense is not standing out, but not needing to stand out. Being unrecognizable, as the theme suggests, does not mean disappearing physically or becoming strange. It means becoming immune to superficial reading, stopping the delivery of overly clear patterns, reducing emotional predictability, regaining control over what is revealed and when it is revealed. This idea often meets resistance. Many associate invisibility with weakness, passivity, or loss of identity. In reality, the opposite happens. Identity strengthens when it no longer depends on constant exposure. Practical psychology shows that people who speak less about themselves, react less, and observe more develop a different kind of presence, harder to decipher. Not because of artificial mystery, but because of internal consistency. They do not need to explain who they are, because their actions do not shift with the environment. Most people live the opposite way. They live reacting, explaining, justifying. Every criticism triggers a response. Every disagreement demands defense. Every external silence creates internal unrest. This pattern creates a completely legible person. Their weaknesses are obvious. Their triggers are known. Their insecurities repeat. Press the same points and the reaction appears. Stoicism considers this a dangerous form of exposure, not because the world is malicious, but because of personal naivety. It is not about distrusting everyone, but understanding that life does not require constant emotional transparency. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself about the importance of preserving inner space, not letting every stimulus pass through the mind, not giving every opinion unrestricted access to one's peace. Being unrecognizable in this context begins with something simple: stopping automatic reactions. Most people don't realize how much they react out of habit. A criticism brings an explanation. A provocation brings defense. A compliment brings dependence. A conflict brings justification. Everything happens too fast, without filter, without choice. This speed creates a rigid identity. People know exactly how you respond. They know what to say to provoke you. They know how to get a reaction. They know where to press. Stoicism proposes a conscious delay, a space between stimulus and response. In that space, something changes. The person becomes less predictable, not because they manipulate, but because they choose. This choice does not happen dramatically. It begins almost invisibly. One extra silence, one fewer response, a reaction that doesn't happen, a comment that isn't made. From the outside, nothing seems different. On the inside, everything begins to reorganize. This process is frightening because it touches identity. Many define themselves by how they react, by what they say, by what they show. Reducing that feels like erasing who they are. In truth, it removes the noise that covers what is essential. The fear of becoming unrecognizable comes from the fear of losing social control, of not being seen, not being considered. But Stoicism teaches that social control was never real. Opinions change, judgments fluctuate, others' expectations are unstable. Building a life on that foundation is building on sand. When someone begins to step out of this game, something curious happens. External reactions lose importance, not because they disappear, but because they stop guiding behavior. The person begins acting according to internal criteria, not external expectations. At first, this is deeply destabilizing. The mind looks for references, validation, signals, and finds silence. That silence is uncomfortable because it offers no immediate feedback, but it is there that strength begins to solidify. Stoicism does not call this coldness. It calls it sobriety, the ability not to give yourself emotionally to everything, not to expose yourself unnecessarily, not to react impulsively. This path is not mystical, it is practical, but it requires awareness, seeing how often you speak without need, react just to relieve discomfort, explain to avoid silence. Stoic invisibility is not escape, it is energy economy, preservation, focus. There is still much confusion around this idea. Many think becoming less predictable means becoming fake, putting on masks, playing psychological games. None of that. Stoicism does not teach manipulation. It teaches alignment. When someone is internally aligned, they do not need to show themselves all the time. They do not need to convince. They do not need to prove. This alignment does not arrive overnight. It begins with discomfort, with the feeling of disappearing in others' eyes. Fewer reactions, fewer comments, fewer questions. To many, this feels like failure, loss of relevance, isolation. In reality, it is simply the end of dependence. That distinction is not yet clear. The mind still confuses visibility with value, still believes being noticed equals being important, still associates silence with weakness. That is why the beginning of this path is unstable. A person restrains themselves, then wants to expose again, observes more, then feels guilty for not reacting, speaks less, then fears disappearing. These conflicts are normal. They reveal how tightly identity was bound to reaction, how much life was lived for others' eyes. Stoicism does not resolve this with slogans. It simply points out, what depends on you is being neglected in favor of what does not. Being unrecognizable at this early stage is not a goal. It is a possible consequence of a change in posture, a change that begins by questioning the constant need to be seen. That question is not fully formed yet. It just starts to appear uncomfortably. Why do I need to react so much? Why do I need to explain? Why does silence bother me so deeply? These questions do not ask for immediate answers. They ask for observation of your patterns, of the urge to expose, of the anxiety when there is no external response. This initial awareness ends here, not with a promise of quick change, not with transformation in a week, but with honest unease. The suspicion that real strength may not lie in being seen, but in knowing when not to show yourself. That real power may not be recognition, but becoming less legible, less predictable, less emotionally accessible. This suspicion is not clarity yet. It is pressure, preparing the ground for a deeper examination of the patterns that sustain the need for constant exposure, and of what truly happens when someone begins, even timidly, to withdraw the excess of themselves from the world. When this unease begins to settle in, something becomes clearer. The impulse to show yourself does not come out of nowhere. It follows clear, repeated, almost mechanical patterns. People react more when they feel ignored. They talk more when they feel insecure. They explain more whenever they sense even the slightest risk of being misunderstood. This is not spontaneity. It is defense. In everyday life, it shows up in simple ways. Someone makes a sharp remark, and the need to justify intentions appears immediately. Silence on the other side creates anxiety and triggers follow-up messages. A minor criticism leads to long explanations. A small compliment is absorbed as proof of worth. This behavior repeats itself across different settings: work, family, friendships, relationships. The contexts change, but the internal structure stays the same. The search for recognition drives the reaction. And where there is a constant search for recognition, there is emotional dependence. The common mistake is believing this is just a personality trait. That's just how I am. I've always been transparent. I like to make everything clear. But when observed more honestly, it becomes clear that this transparency is not a conscious choice. It is an automatic response to discomfort. Stoicism teaches that what is automatic is not free. If a reaction happens without a filter, there was no choice, only conditioning. Epictetus warned that human beings become slaves not to things themselves, but to their reactions to them. When someone always reacts the same way, they give away total predictability, and predictability is a loss of inner power. Another hidden pattern is the confusion between openness and exposure. Openness is the ability to relate with honesty. Exposure is handing over your inner world without discernment. Many believe they are open, when in fact they are simply unprotected. Practical psychology shows that people who overexpose themselves often feel, at some level, that they must explain themselves in order to exist, as if personal value depended on being constantly understood. This creates a permanent state of emotional vigilance. The mind stays busy monitoring others' reactions. The body remains on alert. Rest becomes shallow. The person is always on, even when they shouldn't be. Over time, this creates deep exhaustion. Not just tiredness, but loss of identity. Because identity starts being shaped by external responses. When others react well, there is relief. When they react poorly, there is distress. The inner axis shifts with the environment. Stoicism sees this as a dangerous inversion. What should be central, reason, becomes peripheral. And what should be peripheral, others' opinions, becomes central. Another recurring pattern is the need to anticipate conflict. The person explains themselves before being questioned, justifies decisions no one criticized, defends against attacks that haven't happened yet, all to avoid feeling vulnerable. But this anticipation does not protect. It only reinforces the belief that the world is a constant threat. And the more the mind believes that, the more it reacts. Over the long term, the emotional consequences accumulate. The person begins to feel like they are always giving too much, always available, always open, and yet still feels misunderstood, invisible, undervalued. This paradox is painful. The more someone exposes themselves, the less they feel truly seen. Because exposure does not create respect. It creates consumption. People consume what is given too easily. Stoicism does not see this as others' fault. It sees it as a lack of internal boundaries. Another common misinterpretation is thinking that becoming less visible means becoming indifferent or distant. But what Stoicism proposes is not coldness, it is restraint. Not withdrawal, but discernment. There is also the pattern of emotional reaction as identity. Some people are known for being explosive, sensitive, intense. This becomes a social label. But that label becomes a cage. The person starts behaving according to the role they created. When they try to change, it feels like they are betraying their image. They return to old reactions to maintain external consistency, even at the cost of inner peace. This is a point many overlook. Social identity can become a prison, and the more predictable it is, the harder it becomes to escape. Stoicism sees this clearly. For Marcus Aurelius, a person's value lies not in the impression they make, but in how they govern their own mind. Governing the mind requires reducing unnecessary stimuli. It requires not reacting to everything. It requires accepting that not everything needs a response. But this learning is slow, because reacting offers immediate relief. Silence does not. Silence demands tolerating the tension of not knowing how others will interpret it. It requires enduring the absence of validation. And it is precisely this tension that reveals attachment. Where silence hurts, dependence exists. Over time, people begin to notice their own triggers, certain words, certain tones, certain kinds of criticism. Always the same. The reaction repeats like a conditioned reflex. This awareness does not solve the problem yet, but it unsettles, because it reveals that there is far less freedom than previously assumed. The mind begins to understand that being unrecognizable does not mean changing appearance or behavior in artificial ways. It means interrupting these automatic patterns. It means not offering the same reaction every time, not giving the same emotional access again and again. This interruption does not happen all at once. It starts with small choices: holding a silence, delaying a response, withholding an explanation. These small changes create discomfort. People around you notice. Some push, some provoke, some try to pull the old reaction back. This creates internal tension. The urge to return to the familiar pattern becomes strong, because the pattern, even when harmful, is familiar. Stoicism does not promise comfort at this stage. It promises clarity. Clarity that the discomfort does not come from change itself, but from withdrawing the emotional addiction to external validation. Over time, keeping the same patterns always leads to the same result: excessive exposure, emotional exhaustion, dependence on others' reactions, gradual loss of inner authority. Breaking these patterns requires more than willpower. It requires a shift in perspective, a reframing of what strength, presence, and dignity actually mean. That shift is not complete yet, but the patterns are now visible. They can no longer be easily ignored. The mind begins to see that continuing to react as it always has means continuing to be read, provoked, and affected in the same way. And this realization creates a point of tension, a point where something must change, not in the world, not in others, but in the internal posture toward all of this. This tension prepares the ground for a deeper turning point, one that does not arise from anger or the desire to disappear, but from lucidity, the clarity that perhaps real power lies in no longer being so easily decoded, in not offering automatic responses, in not handing over one's emotional center to every stimulus. That turning point has not yet been made, but it is close. Because now awareness can see where it is trapped. And when a prison is clearly seen, the mind inevitably begins to look for a way out, one that no longer depends on exposure, reaction, or the need to be recognized. This is where the most common mistake happens. Most people believe that to become less predictable, they need to abruptly change their outward behavior, become cold, distant, inaccessible, create a new image. But that only replaces one pattern with another. It is still reaction. It is still dependence, just inverted. Stoicism points in a different direction. The shift does not happen on the outside. It happens in the internal criterion. As long as someone tries to control how they are seen, they remain trapped by others' gaze. As long as they try to appear mysterious, they are still playing the same game, just with a different strategy. Real change begins when the external look stops being the main reference. Epictetus was clear. Anyone who seeks tranquility must first decide what truly depends on them. And almost no one accepts the full answer. Because what depends on us is far less than we would like. Others' interpretations do not depend on us. Their reactions do not depend on us. The meaning they assign to our silence or presence does not depend on us. What depends on us is only internal assent. What we accept as true. What we allow to affect us. The turning point in awareness happens when one realizes that it is not exposure that makes someone vulnerable, but the need for it. It is not reaction that weakens, but the inability to restrain it. It is not being seen that drains strength, but needing to be seen in order to feel whole. Short sentences begin to appear like blades of clarity. I owe nothing to others' reactions. I don't need to explain who I am. Not everything deserves a response. Not everything deserves access. These are not mantras. They are internal limits. Most people go wrong because they try to apply Stoicism as a social technique, as a way to look strong. But Stoicism is not an aesthetic. It is an internal ethic. It is not about appearing unshakable. It is about not letting every stimulus decide for you. At this point, the perception of time changes. Urgency fades. The need to respond immediately dissolves. The space between stimulus and response widens. That space is essential. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself about the importance of not being carried away by first impressions. Impressions arrive quickly. Judgment comes afterward. Most people confuse the two. The Stoic learns to separate them. When someone provokes you, an impression appears. When someone criticizes you, an impression appears. When someone ignores you, an impression appears. But judgment does not need to be immediate. And without immediate judgment, there is no automatic reaction. Here, true unpredictability is born. Not theatrical unpredictability, but the unpredictability of conscious choice. People stop knowing exactly how you will react because you no longer react out of habit. You react by decision. Sometimes you speak, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you step back. Sometimes you stay. Not to confuse, but because the criterion has changed. This reframing is profound because it removes the center of emotional life from the environment and returns it to reason. At this stage, control no longer means controlling others. It means controlling internal consent. What enters, what stays, what passes. Limits stop being something imposed outwardly and become something sustained silently. Up to here, this enters. Beyond this point, it does not. Most people make the mistake of explaining their limits, justifying them, defending them. Stoicism teaches that real limits do not need constant explanation. They show themselves through behavioral consistency. When someone insists, provokes, pressures, they expect the old reaction, and it does not come. Not by calculation, but because the same internal openness is no longer there. The door is closed, not aggressively, but firmly. This often causes confusion in others. Some respect it, some feel uncomfortable, some test it. This should not be read as a sign of error. It is simply life adjusting to a new posture. Most people have never dealt with someone who does not react as expected. That reveals how accustomed they are to emotional predictability. When it disappears, discomfort arises. But that discomfort is no longer yours. Here lies a decisive point in the shift of awareness. The discomfort that used to be absorbed is now returned to the environment. Not through confrontation, but through non-adhesion. The person stops carrying what does not belong to them. This change does not make someone arrogant. It makes them centered. And centered people do not need to explain themselves all the time. Reason, now firmer, begins to organize behavior differently. Fewer impulses, fewer justifications, less exposure, more presence, more observation, more strategic silence. Silence here is not the absence of communication. It is the absence of waste. Silence becomes a filter, a pause, a way to avoid feeding useless dynamics, a means of preserving energy. And something curious happens. The mind feels lighter, less fragmented, less reactive, because it is no longer trying to respond to everything, no longer trying to be everything to everyone. This is the point where many feel fear. Fear of losing connections, fear of seeming distant, fear of becoming irrelevant. Stoicism responds soberly. Connections based on reaction are not sustainable. Relationships that depend on your constant exposure do not respect your limits. Relevance built on exhaustion is not strength. What remains when you speak less, react less, and explain less is what truly matters. The shift in awareness does not create isolation. It creates selection. Selection of what enters, what remains, what deserves emotional investment. This process requires quiet courage, not the courage of confrontation, but the courage to hold your axis without immediate applause. Here, the idea of becoming unrecognizable takes on a new meaning. Not disappearing but no longer being accessible to others' emotional games. Not hiding, but not giving yourself away. You become unrecognizable to those who only knew how to deal with you through reaction. But you become deeply recognizable to those who respect presence, consistency, and silence. That distinction matters. Something essential is now ready to consolidate. Awareness no longer seeks validation. It seeks application. It seeks practice. It seeks to translate this internal posture into daily, simple, repeated choices. The mind is ready for the next step, not to theorize more, but to live according to this newly established axis, to turn lucidity into everyday behavior, to let the quiet strength of reason organize actions, conversations, limits, and attitudes in concrete ways. Clarity is already formed. What remains is full integration into real life. And that is exactly what begins when Stoicism stops being mere understanding and becomes daily practice, shaping someone not into a theatrically distant version of themselves, but into someone solid, discreet, and unshakable, whose presence no longer depends on being recognized in order to be strong. The climax of this change is not external. It is not when others notice something different. It is when you realize that you no longer need to be noticed in order to remain whole. At that point, the idea of becoming unrecognizable stops sounding like a strategy and starts being understood as a consequence of a mind that stopped over-offering itself, of reason taking back command, of someone who no longer reacts by reflex, but by choice. Stoicism has always pointed in this direction, not toward isolation, but toward sovereignty. Epictetus insisted that freedom begins when we stop depending on what we cannot control. And few things are as uncontrollable as how we are perceived. From here on, application becomes concrete. In everyday life, it starts with how attention is used. Attention is the most wasted and least protected resource. People who react to everything give their attention away without criteria. Stoic people choose where to place it. You begin to see that not every opinion deserves a response. Not every comment requires correction. Not every provocation calls for reaction. Silence stops being omission and becomes a filter. That filter is not rigidity, it is clarity. In thought, the practice is direct. When the urge to over-explain appears, reason asks, is this necessary, or is it anxiety? When the impulse to react arises, reason observes. Does this solve anything, or does it only bring momentary relief? This constant examination does not exhaust the mind. On the contrary, it saves energy. Emotions continue to arise as they always have. Irritation, frustration, enthusiasm, disappointment. The difference is that they no longer command. They are felt, acknowledged, and placed where they belong. No emotion is granted automatic authority. This changes posture, tone of voice, the rhythm of responses. Presence becomes more contained, firmer, harder to manipulate. In conversations, the application is clear. You speak less, but with more precision. You don't expose plans too early. You don't share processes still under construction. You don't hand your vulnerabilities to those who don't know how to hold them. This isn't distrust. It's discernment. Stoicism teaches that what is still fragile must be protected until it gains form. Showing everything too early weakens what still needs to mature. Silent boundaries become natural. There's no need for frequent confrontation. No long speeches. Consistent behavior communicates more than any explanation. Up to here, I engage. Beyond this point, I don't. These boundaries are not emotionally negotiated. They are sustained calmly. And over time, the environment adjusts. Some people step away, others respect it, others remain. This outcome should not be managed. It simply unfolds. True strength appears when you stop trying to manage those reactions. Being unrecognizable at this stage means something very specific. It means no longer being decoded through the same emotional shortcuts. Those who once knew exactly how to provoke you no longer do. Those who relied on your reaction now meet neutrality. Those who depended on your explanations now meet silence. This doesn't make you invisible. It makes you illegible to games that no longer make sense. Practical psychology shows that people who reclaim this internal axis are respected differently, not out of fear, but out of moral consistency. They don't change with the wind. They don't adapt to please. They don't expose themselves to belong. They belong to themselves. The final reflection is simple and demanding. Becoming unrecognizable is not disappearing from the world. It is disappearing from the need for constant approval. It is withdrawing your energy from dynamics that build nothing. It is stopping the offering of your center in exchange for momentary attention. This can happen in days, not because the change is superficial, but because the core is a decision. The decision not to react to everything, not to always explain, not to expose yourself without criteria, not to negotiate your emotional dignity. Life goes on, people remain, stimuli don't stop, but your relationship with all of it changes radically when reason takes the lead. You don't need to become cold, you need to become firm. You don't need to distance yourself from everyone. You need to move closer to yourself. You don't need to be invisible. You need to be inaccessible to what destabilizes you. If this reflection brought clarity, it may be worth staying on this path. Subscribing to the channel is simply a calm way to keep deepening this practice of lucidity. Liking the video helps this kind of content continue to exist. And commenting, if it feels right, is an honest way to mark what has shifted in how you see yourself.